Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the 8th week of our series, Made for More, a series in which we're doing a deep dive into the life of a man named Joseph. Joseph overcame a lot of adversity early in life and grew to a position of influence and authority, resulting in him being able to save the lives of thousands, if not millions of people. However, in order to do so, there were a number of character tests he had to pass along the way. And we believe that, like Joseph, you were made for more, and that if you too pass the character test that God puts in front of you, your life can have a greater influence and a lasting impact. And this week, Pastor Nate talked us through the pardon test. Now, at this point in the story, Joseph's been set free from prison. He's now second in command of Egypt, and then for the next 7 years, he's overseeing the Egyptians' preparations for the upcoming global famine, a famine that would not only plague Egypt, but the surrounding nations as well, including Canaan, the land where Joseph's great-grandfather Abraham had settled and where all of Joseph's family lived. And now, about 2 years into that famine, Joseph's brothers come to Egypt looking for food. It's been 22 years since they had last seen their brother Joseph. Now, I'm sure his brothers were befuddled when they found out the Prime Minister of Egypt was actually their little bro who they had sold into slavery. But consider how Joseph must have felt in that moment. I mean, how on earth could you possibly forgive them for what they did? Yet, that's exactly what he does, and it's pretty radical. Joseph chooses to do the one thing that best reflects the character of Christ in the heart of God, and that is to offer them, these guilty offenders, total and complete forgiveness. Now, as Nate clarified, total forgiveness is not approving of what others have done to you. It's not excusing what they've done or denying what they've done or justifying what they've done or forgetting about what they've done or pretending to not be hurt by what they've done or refusing to take the wrong seriously. Total forgiveness is not even about reconciling, as it takes two people to restore a relationship, and forgiveness only requires one. But total forgiveness is about releasing your offender from the debt that they owe you, which not only sets them free, but it sets you free as well. I mean, think about it this way. The devil often tricks us with faulty thinking when it comes to forgiveness. He gets us to believe that by refusing to forgive the offender, we hold all the power. But the opposite is actually true. Unforgiveness causes us to become enslaved. We become enslaved to our past. We become enslaved to our hurts and wounds, which results in bitterness and resentment slowly eating away at our soul. We think that forgiving someone means to let them off the hook, but the opposite is actually true. Forgiving makes it possible to let ourselves off the hook from resentment and anger that will keep our lives stuck in reverse. You see, the person who hurt you may or may not want your forgiveness or even think they need it. They might not be open to your efforts at reconciliation, and they may not even be alive, but the power in forgiveness is not simply to set them free, it's to set you free. Forgiveness is a gift that provides you with freedom from being a prisoner to bitterness and resentment. That doesn't mean forgiveness is easy. The process to forgive someone can be incredibly painful, but the healing makes it worth it. And so, what can we learn about Joseph's life, from Joseph's life, about total forgiveness, and how can we know if we've totally forgiven someone? Well, here's a few things that Pastor Nate shared. When Joseph reveals his true identity to his brothers, the first thing we see is that he kept it quiet and he didn't broadcast to others what they had done. In fact, he sent all of his Egyptian attendants out of the room so he could be alone with his brothers. If you totally forgive someone, you keep what they did to you private so as not to shame them. Now, when Nate said keep it private, he wasn't talking about not telling anyone. It's often wise to confide in someone you trust, like a counselor or a pastor, or in the case of a crime having been committed, always report that to the authorities. I mean, offenders need to be held accountable for their actions, but what Nate was saying is don't go blab the details of how someone has hurt you to anyone and everyone. We often do this for therapeutic reasons, but deep down the real reason is usually rooted in wanting to discredit the other person because we're hurt and we want to reduce their credibility in the eyes of others. The second thing we learn from Joseph about forgiveness is to proceed in tenderness and don't make them feel afraid or intimidated. Joseph didn't conceal his emotion or remain guarded when it came time to reveal his true identity to his brothers. Rather, he did so with tears and compassion. We read about how he wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear him, which led Joseph to do a third thing, which is embrace rather than distance. Allow them to feel your love. Joseph could sense that they were terrified of him, and so he says to them, please come closer. And then later in Genesis 45:10, we read how he tells them, you can live in the region of Goshen where you can be near with me and all your children and grandchildren. Joseph had ascended to the highest position of power and prestige that the Egyptian world had to offer. He could easily have made his brothers kept them at bay and made them bow down to him and worship him, much like he had dreamt years earlier, but his heart was no longer contaminated by pride or arrogance. It rather was filled with a genuine love and affection for his brothers. And so he does what to some is unthinkable. He releases them from negative emotion. He refuses to make them feel guilty. Joseph says, but don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. He knew that they already felt guilty, and he did not want to blame themselves or be angry with themselves anymore. And so he wanted to be set free from their negative emotions. He wanted to set them free from their negative emotions that they had carried. And so Joseph, as he says, don't be upset, don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Can you imagine the look on their faces when Joseph said this? Which leads us to the fifth point of how you know you've totally forgiven someone. It's when you're able to walk in divine perspective and let them save face. Joseph sought to remove this incredible burden of guilt from their shoulders by explaining how God foreknew about the famine and had predestined a descendant of Abraham to live in Egypt so as to preserve their lives. Joseph basically said, hey, somebody had to go first and I was chosen. In saying this, Joseph demonstrated a key component of total forgiveness: the absence of self-righteousness. People who practice total forgiveness are able to see that the many ways in which they need forgiveness, and they're also able to see the many ways in which they're capable of committing similar sins. Joseph recognized that if he were in their shoes, he may have well responded to his youthful arrogance the same way, by selling himself into slavery. Being able to recognize this and being able to trace God's hand in his life allowed Joseph to bless, not curse, to essentially pray blessing over their lives. Look what Joseph says to them in Genesis 45:20. He says, don't worry about your personal belongings, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. You've reached a place of total forgiveness when you can bless rather than curse. R.T. Kendall says it best. He says, how can I know when there's no bitterness left in my heart? It's when I have no desire to get even. It's when I do or say nothing that would hurt their reputation or future. It's when I truly wish them well in all that they seek to do. Now, when it comes to total forgiveness, it also means that you keep on forgiving. It's this lifelong commitment. If we fast forward 20 years later in the story, we see that Jacob, Joseph's father, passes away and his brothers freak out and they become paranoid now that with the father gone, Joseph is going to seek retribution for their cruelty. And so they send this message to Joseph. They say, hey, before father died, he instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sins in treating you so cruelly, so that we, the servants of God, of your father, beg you to forgive our sins. Now, just to be clear, this message was completely bogus. They just made it up to protect their own skin. However, Joseph's reply is very interesting. He says, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? Remember, they've just thrown themselves down at his feet and begged for forgiveness. And Joseph says the most remarkable thing. He says, am I God? In other words, Joseph refuses to play the devil's game. The devil loves to pretend that he is God and loves to get us to pretend that we're God as well. But Joseph recognizes that judging sin is exclusively God's domain, and as such, he recognizes the only appropriate response is to offer forgiveness. And so, with that in mind, Nate offered us 5 practical steps to moving towards forgiveness. First, identify who hurt you. As painful as it might be, you need to think of a person who has hurt you, betrayed you, wronged you, or offended you. And then, once you've done that, you need to determine what that person owes you. In other words, what exactly did they take from you or not give to you? Until you know the answer to that question, you won't be able to experience true freedom, because general forgiveness doesn't heal specific hurts. That's why you need to figure out exactly what they owe you. What did they take from you? What did they not provide you? The third step is to accept what has occurred and grieve what was lost. Acceptance does not mean approval. It simply means you acknowledge what was taken and that you accept that it cannot change. The fourth step is to release them from their debt. Decide that they don't owe you anything anymore. It's natural that you want to be repaid for what's been taken from you, but the problem is that in most cases, this is impossible to do. Can a dad who abandoned his kids ever really replace what has been taken from them? Or can a mother repay her grown daughter for not being there to tuck her into bed at night when she was a child? How do you repay such things? You can't. It's why the best thing to do is cancel their debt. Release them from whatever they owe you. To insist on being repaid is to set ourselves up for unnecessary heartbreak. All that does is allow the seeds of bitterness to take root and grow in your life. And when that happens, we allow that person to hurt us not once, but over and over again. It's why you need to release them from their debt. And then the final step for total forgiveness is to dismiss the case. Dismissing the case centers on a daily decision not to reopen it again. And what makes that so difficult is that our feelings don't automatically follow our decisions. In most cases, no sooner have we forgiven someone than something happens to remind us of that hurt or disappointment all over again. And when our memories are triggered, those old feelings come flooding back. And when that happens, one of two things usually occurs. First, we either take hold of the offense all over again and we revisit the hurt, we reopen the case, or two, we try not to think about it and we turn our thoughts elsewhere, but neither approach really works. When memories of past hurts flood your mind, the best thing to do is to go ahead and face them. Allow yourself to remember the incident. But instead of reopening the case against your offender, take this opportunity to restate your decision. You can even say these words out loud: he or she doesn't owe me anything. Then thank your Heavenly Father for giving you the grace and strength to forgive them. Don't accept the lie that you haven't forgiven them. Instead, focus on the truth that this debt has been canceled. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping into discussion questions. I'll see you next time. And remember, you were made for more.